Hello, this is James Renner telling you to subscribe to Buddy Candela, or else.
How's it going, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of my new podcast for the Halloween season, the Buddy's House of Horror podcast. Now, if you've been following my channel for a long time, you know that Halloween time is my favorite time of year, and I want to do something special this year in addition to the regular shows that I do every October. Every Saturday, you're still going to be getting a new episode of Two Nerds, a Podcast, and a new episode of Lost on VHS during the week, but on top of that, you're going to be getting a House of Horrors podcast, and most likely another special video every single week in October. So that's 2 podcasts a week, a new episode of Lost on VHS, and probably something else Halloween related for this entire month. So needless to say, I'm keeping myself pretty busy, so if episodes end up coming out a little later than expected, I do apologize for that. So for this podcast, I wanted to set up interviews with some very interesting people and people that I've been wanting to talk to for a long time. I'm really looking forward to sharing all these incredible interviews with you over the next month with experts from the horror field, filmmakers, actors, authors, and even the former high school friend of one of our country's most disturbing serial killers, Jeffrey Dahmer. Because for me, Halloween doesn't necessarily always have to be about ghosts and goblins, but it can also focus on the sort of horrors of real life. And that's what you're going to get today with my conversation with James Renner. James is not only an accomplished author in the fiction world, but he is also a true crime expert and one of the key components in the research and investigations of such cases as the disappearance of Maura Murray and the Amy Mihaljevic case. As I mentioned before, James is also an accomplished novelist with his book The Man from Primrose Lane currently being adapted into a series by some major players out in Hollywood. Not only are we going to be talking about his novels and his true crime books, but we're also going to be touching on his childhood, how he became interested in being a true crime investigator, as well as his time at my alma mater, Kent State. We're also going to be talking about his time investigating and researching supernatural creatures for his book, It Came From Ohio, which focuses on the Mothman, Bigfoot, the Loveland Frog, among many others. Originally, we were going to do this podcast on Skype for you guys so you could see full video of our conversation, but of course, with my luck, my Skype recorder randomly decided to stop working as soon as I got James on the line. So unfortunately, we had to go with talking over the phone as a backup, so I do apologize for the lack of video, and the audio quality not being as good as usual, doing to have to hold the phone up to a microphone, but hey, you gotta do what you gotta do. Before we get started with the interview, if you're interested in purchasing any of James's books, such as True Crime Addict or The Man from Primrose Lane, you can find links to his online store as well as all of his social media at jamesrenner.com. And as always, if you're not subscribed to this channel, make sure you hit that red subscribe button, smash that like button, and share this video with a friend. Without further ado, enjoy the very first episode of the House of Horrors podcast with James Renner. So I've been seeing a lot on your social media, this Virtually a Detective, your new series that's coming out. What can you, what's all about that? I love the title, by the way, Virtually a Detective. It's a good play on words there. So what's that show all about?
Thanks. Yeah, so it's an idea I've had for a while, and the equipment and technology to do virtual reality filming and 360-degree video became manageable. It became cheap enough to pick up from online, and I got this attachment for my iPhone that allows you to capture 360-degree video, and it even has halfway decent sound, although I also recorded the sound on another separate device. And, so I was looking for something to showcase using this new technology, and I was at Crime Con this year, which is the annual convention for true crime that's put on partly by the Oxygen Network and various organizations, and it was the second year that this Crime Con has gone on, and it was in Nashville. Anyway, I went down there, I sold a lot of books and met a lot of people, and one day I was sitting at my little table, and this young woman comes up and starts talking to me about writing, and she's interested in writing a book herself, and she looked young enough, like, what are you going to write about? What do you want to write about? Have you experienced enough to write about anything? She told me that her sister had been murdered a year before, and I realized that I was talking to Kelsey German, who is the sister of Libby German. Libby German and Abby Williams were murdered in Delphi, Indiana in February of 2017. And it's a really sad case, but very solvable. The circumstances of the crime were that it was a day off of school, and Kelsey and Abby were driven to this nearby park that had this walking trail. And the girls walked down the trail and came to this old abandoned bridge that is like 60 feet high, and it's something that the neighborhood kids kind of dare each other to cross. And so that's what they did. They crossed this bridge that day, and they got to the other side. And on the other side is kind of nothing. It's private property, and there's really nobody else over there except for the people that have houses further back that way. So it's kind of a desolate, empty area that nobody goes to. So they had crossed the bridge, and they looked over, and they saw a man crossing the bridge towards them. And Libby was smart enough to capture this man's picture on her iPhone, and then she set her Snapchat on. And so we also have his voice saying down the hill as he directed them down the hill from where they were. Apparently the girls realized something was not quite right as he was crossing the bridge. So anyways, we don't know the details of what happened in the next hour or so, but both girls were murdered and attacked. So this crime is unsolved to this day, even though we have this guy's picture, even though we have his voice. So Kelsey asked if there's anything I could do to help, to let her know. So I looked at it, and I thought it was a perfect case for this virtual reality camera, because people are interested in the Delphi case from all over the world and UK, and there's a lot of people that can't ever drive out there to see what it's like. And hearing about these cases is one thing, but if you're able to step into those locations, you see a lot more, you learn a lot more, and that's what this is about. So it's an immersive true crime web series. So you can watch it on your VR headset and look around as if you're actually there, following next to me as I interview these people and go out to the bridge and show you around Delphi. You can watch it on YouTube too, and just use your cursor to scroll around to look at what you want, kind of like Google Maps. So it's really interesting. It's a new way to look at true crime.
Cool. Okay, just 1 second. So I guess while we're on the subject of YouTube and all that, and before we dive too deep into conversation here, where can people follow you on social media? What's your YouTube? Where can people buy your stuff? And just anything you want to plug, just throw it out right now.
So if anybody's interested in my books or YouTube or the series or anything, the best place to go is jamesrenner.com. You'll find links there to whatever you want, whatever your vice is.
Cool. For those of you who don't know James Renner, you're going to get to know him pretty well today, I hope. He is not only an author, as he said, he has written many books. He's also a producer, director. He is a serial killer hunter, and he's been a key factor in many true crime cases that have been going on, specifically the Amy Mihaljevic case, the Maura Murray case, and he was even involved with the Cleveland abduction case, which everyone knows about. But before any of that, let's basically go back to how you got interested in true crime to begin with. And if you've listened to James's podcast, The Philosophy of Crime, you already know the answer to this. If you haven't, definitely go check that out. But tell us about how you got interested in true crime and how you started with the Amy Mihaljevic case.
Yeah, so everything goes back to the Amy Mihaljevic case. This was a young girl who I should start by saying that both Amy and I were born in 1978. And in 1989, she was about to turn 11, and this was in October 27th, 1989. And young Amy was abducted from Bay Village, Ohio. It's on the west side. It's kind of an affluent suburb. And her kidnapper had planned this meeting with her under the guise that he convinced her that he had worked with her mother, and her mother had gotten a promotion at work, and he was going to take her to get a present to surprise her. Now, that was all an elaborate hoax, but it worked. She agreed to meet with him, and so it wasn't like he snatched this kid and, she screamed and all that. She went willingly with her abductor because she trusted him. And he arranged this pickup after school on a Friday afternoon. It was a warm autumn day in Bay Village, and he took her from this plaza, which is right across the street from the police station. And she disappeared. And it was big news, and at the time my mother lived in Rocky River, and I'd go up there on the weekends and spend time with her, and I'd see Amy's poster on telephone poles all over the place, and, in stores, and everybody was looking for her. And, being the same age, I had turned 11 earlier that year. I, for whatever reason, took it upon myself to try to figure out what happened to her. Even at age 11, I used to get on my Huffy bike, and I'd ride it up to Westgate Mall, and I'd look for Amy in the crowds, thinking that the mall was where the most people were at any given time. And if she got, separated or maybe she would be taken there, or maybe that's where she'd end up. And unfortunately, they found her body on County Road 1181 in Ashland County just a couple months later, in the beginning of 1990. And so I kept going back to that mall at that point, looking for her killer, based on the composite sketch that was provided by a couple classmates of hers that saw her walk away with this man. So, at a very early age, I became interested in true crime and thinking that I could investigate on my own and help these cases. And so Amy's case never really went away. I always kind of thought about it. I went to Kent State. I worked for the student newspaper, and after graduating, I eventually ended up getting a job with Cleveland Scene, which was, that free newspaper that you can pick up in record stores and bars and other seedy places. And it was a blast to go work there for 7 or 8 years. And, Amy's story was the first story I pitched, and by that time, 16 years had passed. And I figured, by then, the police must have known who did it. They just didn't have enough evidence to convict. And, that was a very naive reporter's thing to think, because what I quickly figured out was the reason why they've never been able to solve this case is there are too many men with the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime. The best the FBI has ever been able to do is narrow that down to a top 25 list. And so it was much too big for an article, even though it did become one of my first articles. So I kept researching it, and that article became my first book. And my book on the Amy Mihaljevic case came out in 2006. And then everything kind of came out of that. I used to go to library talks and talk about Amy's disappearance, and people would come up to me afterwards and say, hey, have you ever looked into the case of Beverly Jaros or Bethany Potts or, Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus? So I started becoming quickly known as the true crime guy in Cleveland. I started collecting these stories, and that led to several more true crime books. And then I became a little tired of delving into real-life murders and victims and things like that, so I switched over to fiction. And my first novel came out in 2012 called Man from Primrose Lane. And since then, I've mostly written fiction, except for my last book, which was called True Crime Addict, which was about the disappearance of Maura Murray. But, I can trace my career and everything that I'm doing now to that obsession with trying to find Amy's killer when I was 11 years old.
Cool. So what kind of was it like as a kid who's interested in true crime and all that? Like, there was, the internet was in its infant stages. back then when a lot of this stuff was kind of going on. And like, what do kids in school think when you say, "Hey, I'm into serial killers and true crime"? Like, what was high school and all that like for you?
I think, I got one of those, most creative or something, the senior expletives or, whatever they call them. But
Senior superlatives.
Yeah, superlatives, that's right. I was always doing something a little bit different, a little bit creative. I used to, in high school, I would film these little movies that were about 45 minutes long to an hour with my friends using VHS camcorders, and I used to edit them with 2 or 3 VCRs all linked together, and I had to edit linearly, and it was quite a project. And
it's called the Cinemassacre technique, because it's a massacre of cinema.
Sure. But, so I had a lot of fun with that. I put these movies together, and then I'd rent out the town hall, and I'd make popcorn, and we'd all, and I'd charge admission like $5 to come in and see the movie, and so that's what I was doing in high school. And so I've always kind of gone back and forth between true crime and entertainment and novels. Currently, what's paying the bills is I'm adapting The Man from Primrose Lane into a TV series. So I should have some more news on that in December, I think.
Cool. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that later on. But before we get to your other books and stuff, you mentioned you went to Kent State. I also went to Kent State. What?
Golden Flashes.
Yeah. What? So, I'm assuming you went for journalism? Is that a fair?
I did not. I have an English degree from Kent State with a minor in writing, so I spent a lot of time at Satterfield Hall. And but I would also write opinion pieces opinion pieces, editorials for the newspaper. So over time, I really started to enjoy that, working for the newspaper, and also the television production house, the TV2 they called it at Kent State.
Oh, it's still called that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And when I was doing it, when I started there, they were just doing news, because the channel would go out to the local communities of Ravenna and Kent there, and I showed them a way that they could do a new way of doing underwriting, and it allowed them to pay for other productions, and so they let me have my own late night TV talk show.
Last Call.
Last Call with Mike Polk and Chad Zumach, and Aaron McBride and Jeff Edders, and they all went on to do really cool things. Chad's a stand-up comic now, and Mike Polk is too, but he's also doing plays, and he's got his own show on Fox 8 on Sundays, I believe.
Cool. So why Kent State?
I think a couple reasons. I thought that maybe I'd go to college and become an FBI agent. I had that interest in investigation, but then I met my wife, and that kind of changed my path. And I thought, hey, I'll go to school and become an English teacher. So Kent State was close by and affordable, and I made I got lots of student loans, and it was just a place I was familiar with, and I knew that I could get through it without really studying too hard, I guess. And so that's why Kent State. And then my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, she was going to Ashland, and so we both had our space during the week, and then we see each other on the weekends.
Very, very cool. And now Kent State is the home of your Maura Murray archives, correct?
Yeah, both the Maura Murray archives and also my documents related to the Amy Mihaljevic case. and several other cases that I've investigated for my other articles and books. And what it's all up in a special collections, which is the top of the library in Kent State, also the tallest building in Portage County. And if you make an appointment, you can go up there and look through the boxes and boxes of notes I have on the Mihaljevic case and the Maura Murray case. And they're trying to build specifically a true crime library up there. So it's my stuff, but it's also a couple other writers that have donated their notes and material there so they can build up a true crime archive.
Very, very cool. So,
Thanks.
so after college, you sort of became part of an elite group. I believe it's called the Dollar Club, or is the Dollar Project?
Oh, yeah.
So, explain
Dollar Babies.
the Dollar Babies. Okay, so yeah, obviously it's pretty elite class. I believe Frank Darabont is with you in the same class.
Indeed.
Indeed.
Yes, so the Dollar Baby program was a little-known program that Stephen King had for aspiring filmmakers. And what it was is you could send him your idea on how to adapt one of his short stories. And if you figured out how to contact him, and this was in the days, the internet was like a year or two old at the time. So it's really hard. It was, at the time, it was really hard to track down anybody if you didn't have the local numbers. So anyways, if you could track down Stephen King's office and his people, and you sent them your plans to adapt a short story, they would allow you to have the rights to that story for 1 year for $1, and that's how it became known as the Dollar Baby Club. And that allowed you to adapt and film and produce a work, a film or a video, whatever you wanted to put together based on that short story. The only stipulation was you couldn't sell it, and you couldn't. So it was specifically meant for film festivals and your director reel, just so you could build it up. And yes, Frank Darabont was, I think, the second person to apply and get through the Dollar Baby program. And I think I was like number 9 or 10. And since then, now it's like in the 50s and 60s. There's a bunch of people that have done that. So my project was based on the short story, All That You Love Will Be Carried Away, which is one of the few Stephen King stories that doesn't have any supernatural element. It's about a traveling salesman who is considering putting together a book that's a collection of graffiti and sayings and funny things he's found in the stalls of bathrooms across the United States. Very weird idea, but I got Joe Bob Briggs, the guy that used to introduce monster movies for TNT.
Monster Vision, yeah, the second incarnation of Monster Vision, yeah.
Joe Bob Briggs started it, and then I also got Michael Stanley to play a cop, and Harvey Picard played the hotel clerk. And Harvey was, great, but very cantankerous, and his daughter helped me get him into the movie, and she's the one that explained to me, if you really want him to be in this, you have to make sure that he has no way to get off set. So we sent a car up to get him, so he didn't drive, and then brought him down, and he was on the set like 5 minutes. He's like, this is ridiculous. I want to get out of here. I'm like, I'm sorry, we can't get you home until after you do the scene. So we kind of kidnapped Harvey Picard.
Yeah.
And then the film premiered at the 2005 Montreal World Film Festival, and played up there, which was real fun. And it was the start of a professional, great movie making, and that's still something I'm very interested in, and hopefully getting back to. I've got a documentary that is going to premiere at the Chagrin Documentary Film Festival next month, so I'm trying to get back to that world. It's been a while.
What was Joe Bob like to work with? Because like you see him on Monster Vision, and then even in his new show now, he just seems like really laid back and just like a fun-loving like kind of guy. Like, first off, how did you get him for the role, or any of these guys for the role, and what were they like?
Yeah, Joe Bob was awesome. I was trying to find somebody for the movie, and I remember having dinner with my dad at a Mexican restaurant in Cuyahoga Falls, and we were talking about, I'm like, who can I get that would be gettable? And my dad was a big Joe Bob Briggs fan. He used to read his articles and bring them home for me to read. And so it dawned on me. I'm like, oh my gosh, I better go get Joe Bob Briggs. So again, I tracked down these people, and you'd be surprised. I mean, you probably know this, but these actors that are familiar that we know that maybe aren't real busy at the moment, if you can find a way to reach out to them, they want to work on something, and if you can pay them a decent day rate and cover their expenses and travel, there's a good chance you can get some of these actors to appear in your projects. And he was a really cool guy. I remember the one weird little story I have to share about Joe Bob is he hates flying. He will not fly. So we had to bring him in from New York on an Amtrak. So my producer, who was a lawyer in Cleveland, David Thomas, not the guy from Wendy's.
Yeah.
But David Thomas is my friend, and he's a lawyer, and he's great, but the best way I can describe him is he is kind of the living incarnation of Better Call Saul, of Saul Goodman. And he even kind of looks like him and has the same mannerisms and way of expressing himself. So if you can picture, like, Saul Goodman waiting in an Amtrak station at 2 o'clock in the morning to get Joe Bob Briggs off this train, that's kind of how the whole thing started. And then, the Amtrak train left for New York after the shoot at like 2 a.m. too. And I told him, I said, Dave, whatever you do, make sure you're at the station in time, because that train's not going to wait. You got to get, and then we're screwed. He's like, I'll take care of it, because I knew they were going to go out drinking. And sure enough, they went out and had a few too many, and they missed they missed Joe Bob's train back to New York. So at that point, there's no other way to get him home except for flying. So I know he was pretty upset about that, but we covered the expense of the plane ticket too.
Of course. So overall, it was a pretty good experience making that, and then it premiered at the film festival. And then what kind of happened after that with it?
Yeah, so eventually you reach this point, especially then when technology wasn't quite as affordable as it is today, where I've done filmmaking to a point where I've done as best as I could with independent funding. So the next step is to become an actual director or a writer, where people are funding your movies, where studios are funding your movies, where you're allowed to go out and do it, and film and become this director. But I still didn't really have any connection. So I did a couple things. One, I started volunteering at the Sundance Film Festival, and I just worked in the travel department there, and got people on their buses to the films that they needed to reach, and made some connections out at Sundance. And I also realized that my strength at the time was writing. I could write a decent paragraph, and I was starting to get more and more into journalism. And it dawned on me that it's going to be a long con, but I think my chances of becoming a director are better if I apply myself to writing and work up from there. And I was right. But it took me a lot longer than I thought. I started writing seriously in 2004, and I'm just now, in 2018, 14 years later, to the point where I am writing screenplays, and I'm adapting novels and original work for for studios. I've been paid, the last couple projects through NBC Universal and Fox and Hulu, and so I'm where I want to be. It just took a long time to get there.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
So you did the Stephen King film, you wrote the Amy Mihaljevic book, obviously, and then you did a couple other things, and then you kind of wanted to take a break from the nonfiction book writing and start writing some fiction. So then comes The Man from Primrose Lane and The Great Forgetting. So I have not read either of these books yet. I do plan on doing so. But what can you tell me about these books?
So The Man from Primrose Lane it's loosely based on a real crime that I wrote about and investigated for Cleveland Scene. The case, what I call an unsolved suicide, which occurred in 2002. This guy, Joseph Newton Candler, was living in Eastlake and lived in this efficiency. He was somewhere in his 80s or late 70s, and one day he he bought a gun, and then locked up his apartment, closed the windows, went into the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, shot himself in the head, and nobody found his body for like a week. It was in the middle of summer, so decomposition was a problem, so they weren't able to get his fingerprints when they found him. But they knew his name from, the lease, and they went to contact next of kin, and they traced down a sister, and they called her up and said, "Hey, we got some bad news. Your brother committed suicide." And she's like, "That's impossible. My brother died in 1948 in a car accident when he was 8 years old." And that's how the police found out that this old man in Eastlake had been living under a fake name in Cleveland for 30 years. And so it's a fascinating case. In fact, it was just solved using this new DNA technique a couple months ago. But it had been a big unsolved case for many years, and I started wondering, I wanted to write a novel, and I wanted it to be a mystery, and so this made a good beginning. And I thought, well, what would be the weirdest explanation I could come up with for who this man really was? And then I thought, well, what if he was me, who had come back, from the future to stop one of these, Amy Mihaljevic or somebody else, one of these crimes from ever occurring, and got stranded in the past. And so that's kind of the seed of what became The Man from Primrose Lane, which is kind of this detective noir, about this journalist who is searching a very similar case, who slowly realizes that there's time travel involved. And that book came out in 2012, did really well, and it was a two-book deal with this publisher, and she, kind of sight unseen took the idea for my second novel, which is The Great Forgetting. And it was, all my life I've just wanted to be a legitimate author, and here I was with this publisher, this national publisher, this very fancy publisher, in fact, who wanted my next book. So it was like handing the keys to the kid, and he just took off with it. So what I turned in for my second book was a 950-page monster called The Great Forgetting, and the publisher took one look at it and said, nobody's going to read this thing. You have to cut this thing down to under 500 pages. And so I spent the next 2 years whittling away at this book until I got it down to a manageable, 425 manuscript pages. So I cut out more of The Great Forgetting than ended up in it. And essentially the book is another mystery, but it's also a love letter to conspiracy theories and kind of the X-Files and Twilight Zone. And the idea is, what if all these little conspiracy theories like fluoride in the water and mind control and human-animal hybrids, what if all these conspiracy theories we have out there, what if they're really true? And not just that, what if they're all main character's a history teacher from Lakewood, Ohio, and he gets pulled into this plot and ends up trying to save the world.
Very, very cool. So you had to obviously you cut out a lot of the book. How did you kind of determine how to do that? Because obviously you had to cut like a lot, you know?
Yeah, whole characters and settings and scenes. It was really difficult. It was very difficult.
You couldn't have just left it on a cliffhanger and then maybe they would have picked you up for a third book?
I don't think... There was conversation about maybe turning it into 3 separate books and turning it into a young adult series, but I didn't really want anything to do with that. And, so I looked at it and I took basically the parts that were really working well and tried to figure out a way that I could condense the rest of the story. And if I ever get, to the point where a lot of people want to read my stuff, and I'm not there yet, even though the books do fairly well. But if I'm ever a popular writer, my goal is to go back and have a complete and uncut version of The Great Forgetting, because it was, there's so much fun stuff that I had to get rid of that I'd like to see one day.
Yeah. So your most recent book, and probably what you're most known for is am I right by saying that you're most known for the Maura Murray case?
Yeah, it's definitely sold more than all my other books, maybe combined.
Cool. So I'm talking about True Crime Addict, which if you have not yet read, I highly suggest you all go out and buy it and read it. Obviously, we can't get into every single detail with the Maura Murray case because it's really complex, and you have a whole podcast about it. You have a whole book about it. So I guess kind of give us as much as you can of the Maura Murray case. I know you're probably sick of talking about it. You told the story 100 times, but
no. Yeah. So the general idea. So I had this thought that I knew true crime. It was right at that time. I just had a hunch that true crime was going to be big, and it was something I knew how to write. And so I was looking around for a bigger story, something on a national level that I could really spend some time digging into. And I remember sitting at home and watching a 2020 special about 2 women who disappeared, and one of them was Brooke Wilberger, and the other was Maura Murray. And Brooke Wilberger's case was very typical, and it's very obvious. It's a case you've heard over and over again. It's incredibly tragic, but it's a simple case of an abduction. Now, with Maura Murray, right away, my ears perked up, and I realized there's something more here, because the gist of it is, in 2004, this is the week that Facebook launched, so it's the first big mystery of the social media age. Maura Murray was a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst studying nursing. On a Monday afternoon, she emailed her professors and said, "There's been a death in the family. Hold my work till the end of the week." That was a lie, by the way. Nobody died. She then gets in her car, goes and picks up a bunch of booze, more than one person would need, goes to the ATM, empties out her bank account to the tune of, it was only like $280. Then she drives north for, a couple of hours, hour and a half or something like that, into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And it's about 7:30 that night, so it's dark, it's February, very dark, and she comes to this like 90-degree turn in the road, and she crashes her car into the snowbank. And there are 3 houses nearby that had a sight line through the accident scene, and they were close enough that they heard the crash. And this is fairly typical for them in the winter out there. People crash at that curve a few times every year. So when they heard the crash, there were 2 911 and reported the crash so the police could get out there. Now, between the time of the 911 call and the responding officer is anywhere between 3 minutes, but probably no longer than 7 minutes. And somewhere in that window, Maura Murray disappears, never to be seen again. So I saw this, and right away I realized this isn't one mystery, this is two. What happened to Maura Murray, but also what was she doing in the White Mountains to begin with? And I figured if I could answer one of those questions, I'd get close to the answer to the other one. So I spent the next 5 years researching the case, and I came to believe that Maura, there was a lot of trouble and a lot of drama going on in her life, and I think she was trying to get away from the men in her life, and that's what drove her up into the White Mountains.
Yeah, because I guess at the time, I mean, I was a kid when they were reporting this, so I don't really remember anything because I wasn't aware of it at the time. But she was kind of painted as like an all-American girl, correct? And then the more layers you unpeel, you kind of realize that she wasn't what she seemed.
Oh yeah, very, very much like a Laura Palmer type of character. In fact, I think there was even an article that referred to her as the all-American girl, but and that was, as a journalist, it just something didn't ring true to that, and I started looking into her background. One of the first things I found was that at the time of her disappearance, she was in trouble for credit card fraud and identity theft, and she had only ended up at the University of Massachusetts Amherst because she was about to get kicked out of the first school that she attended, which was West Point. And the reason she got in trouble at West Point is she stole from Fort Knox. She stole from the most secure facility in the United States, but it wasn't like she stole like gold bullion or anything like that. What she stole was makeup from the commissary, like $5 worth of makeup. So that to me was like a cry for help. Maybe she wanted out of West Point, but couldn't bring herself to do it the typical way. So there was a lot of stuff going on in her life, not the least of which was a boyfriend who, by all accounts, seems to be a dangerous person. Right now he is facing there's a grand jury going on in Washington, D.C., where he lives now, because he's been accused of assaulting women in the D.C. area.
Yeah, so actually I think you were on Twitter yesterday talking about that, right?
Yeah, because he's got, he's been quiet for many years, but all of a sudden, he started tweeting out some nasty things about me and calling me a stalker, and it's like, hey man, I'm just a journalist. I'm gathering and reporting facts. But we live in a time where if you don't agree with the facts, you attack the reporter, and you call it fake news. And so he's taken a page from Trump's book and coming after me.
Yeah. So speaking of yourself and people coming after you, there's a lot of you in the book. It's called True Crime Addict, and I think the book is as much about Maura as it is about you and your journey in this story. And it kind of gets into some heavy stuff. Like when I started it, I didn't expect everything that was in it. I mean, you go from there's issues with mental health, there's drug-related things, there was, and I guess you say this in the book, so I guess I can say it here, there was a little driving under the influence to get in the state of mind that Maura was in at the time. You go into family problems, stuff with your son, you get thrown in jail, and you even go into like your past life where you were almost abducted and issues with your family.
When I was 13 years old, not like when I was like Cleopatra in Egypt or anything.
Yeah.
Meaning when I was younger, not a past life.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. There's some heavy stuff in there. It was very cathartic to write, and I was a mess when I was researching the Maura Murray case, and part of that was because Maura Murray and her family and everybody surrounding her, they're just toxic, just toxic people. And, I lived in that world for a few years, and it wears on you. It gets to you.
Yeah, so what is it about I guess you touched on this a little bit, but what is it about this case that really drew you in and what really draws a lot of people in and has them talking even today?
The reason why the Maura Murray case is so popular, in my opinion, is because it works as a Rorschach test, where those tests where you look at the ink blot on the piece of paper and the psychiatrist says, "What do you see?" And whatever you see is really kind of what's going on in your own consciousness and your own subconscious. And same thing with the Maura Murray case, because there's enough clues that depending on who you are and where you come from and what's going on in your life, you can determine whether or not you believe that Maura ran away, or whether she was abducted by a random stranger, or if she was murdered by somebody that she knew, if it was related to drugs, if it was, you can go 1,000 different ways. And so people read into Maura's case what they bring to it. So they see themselves reflected in this case and come to a conclusion based on their own personal experiences. So that makes the case so personal to everybody that thinks about it. And so when you start to argue that, no, that's probably not what happened, it's this thing that probably happened, they take it as a personal attack. And I think that's why you get so many people that are so passionate and angry, and they fight about the little details of this case because they see themselves in it.
Yeah. So speaking of people being angry about it, her family did not want you to write this book at all.
Yeah. So I could have stepped away at that point, because one of the first people I contacted was Maura's father, and I really kind of wanted the family's permission to look into this. And the word got back from the father, and he said he didn't want to have anything to do with the book. And that to me was, as a reporter, that's another red flag. It's like, what father of a missing young woman would not want more attention on that case? And there's reasons for that. I think her dad didn't want all this stuff about the credit card fraud and identity theft, and she had stuff like she was having an affair with the track coach, and into promiscuous things, just like any college student. So he probably knew that all that was going to come out and was trying not to get it out there. But as a father of a girl, I've got a daughter, I've got a son. If they were missing, I'd move heaven and hell to figure out what happened. And I don't care what kind of personal demons you drag out in order to figure out what happened to them. Do what you need to do. That's how a normal father reacts. But Fred's not normal. So I started to wonder why. So instead of turning me away from the case, it caused me to look a little deeper.
So the Maura Murray case is still unsolved. There's a lot of theories out there as to what really happened. Some of them are outright ridiculous, like a serial killer picking her up and stuff of that nature. What do you think is the most plausible explanation? Do you think it's that she's living in Canada?
Well, I did for a while, and I still hope that that's the case, because I want to hope that she's alive. But the more time that's passed, the less likely that probably is the case. Now, what I've come to believe is most likely is that the one thing that I believe that I came away from my research believing 100% is that when Maura went up to the White Mountains, she was not traveling alone, that she was traveling with a tandem driver. And I think it might have been some friends from school or friends from elsewhere, other girls. And I think they were driving up, maybe staying at a cabin. But Maura had been looking into rental properties that had more than one bedroom, which I think is the biggest clue that most people overlook in this case. She wasn't trying to find just a place for her. She was trying to find a place for her and friends. So I think there was this tandem driver that was ahead of her. She got in the accident, and they came back and picked her up. what I've come to believe lately is that she made it to her destination and had planned to stay there the week, and I think the friends were going to come back at the end of the week to pick her up because they ended up going back to school or wherever they came from, leaving Maura at this cabin or wherever she was alone for the rest of the week. And so she didn't have cell phone service. She didn't have the internet. She wasn't aware that her crash had become a missing persons case. And I think somebody that she knew and trusted tracked her down before the police did. And I think they flew into a rage because here's Maura. She's created this drama again. Look at all the trouble she's put us through. Whoever it was that was close enough to her, I think they flew into a rage, and I think she was probably murdered by somebody she knew at a different location.
Yeah. So you talk about the Maura Murray case a lot more in detail in your book as well as your podcast, The Philosophy of Crime. Right now you've got 6 episodes out, but you recently stated that Season 2 is in the works. What can we expect from Season 2, and when do you think it'll be out?
A podcast, who knew? They're suddenly popular again. It's like, almost like, it feels to me like we're going back to the days where we'd sit around the radio and listen to these teleplays. So it's really neat. I wanted to do a true crime podcast, but there's so many podcasts out there that cover crimes that have already occurred. I didn't want to just be another one of those. So it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do, and what I realized were there were a lot of questions that came up during investigations into true crime and thinking and reading about true crime, and there's nobody answering these questions. Like, why is true crime so popular? Why do people do bad things? What makes a person bad? Is it were they raised that way, or is it biological? So I wanted to tackle the big questions behind true crime and do it from a philosophical standpoint. Like, what would Socrates have to say about this? What would Plato say? What would Camus and Foucault and all these people that these fancy people that I studied in English lit and comparative studies and those classes that were part of my master's. And so that's what I did, and that was the first season. So season 2, I will do what I did with season 1, which is one day I will release all 6 episodes, and you can binge them if you want. Each episode's about 25 minutes to a half an hour. If that, I think some of them are even a little bit shorter than that. But each episode's a question. And this new season, some of the things I'll be getting into are capital punishment and how that came about and why we have it here in the United States and why we're the last developed country that still has that and what it means, and how we treat prisoners. And there's another episode I like to get, I'll have the serious questions, but I also get weird sometimes, and delve into like quantum mechanics and what that has to do with investigating true crime and fun stuff like that. One of the fun episodes for season 2 will be a look into this thing that happens sometimes called folie à deux, and it's where somebody like Charles Manson or
so it means
Jim Jones,
2 becomes 1 or 2 as 1 or something?
Yeah, basically. And what it is when somebody convinces somebody else of their delusion. So it's almost like mass hysteria, but it's driven by one very conniving and clever and attractive mind, like a Charles Manson, where he convinces him and his followers that of this, delusional reality where it's suddenly okay to kill people, and how humans can fall into that, how they can be convinced that that things are not as they really are, and how they get sucked into delusions. It's very scary stuff, but I see it all the time. I see it in the Maura Murray case online, where people have broken into these different factions based on what they believe, and will attack anybody that disagrees with them. And it's something to do with the human condition. For some reason, we're very
Very cool. So season 2 of Philosophy of Crime is coming out soon, and I guess to kind of close things out here, it's the Halloween season, and we're moving away from the horrors of real life, and let's talk a little bit about actual horrors, some supernatural stuff, because the book I was introduced to you by, where I discovered you, was It Came From Ohio.
Oh, cool.
So tell us about why you wanted to write a book about that and how all that came about, and if you have any stories in your travels researching these supernatural things.
Sure. Yeah. So when I was a kid, I was really taken by these series of books called Haunted Ohio, and I collected all of them, and they were just simple little regional books put together by a printer and a writer, and they were a collection of local legends and tales. And growing up in the country, I know that wherever you're from, whatever small town you're from, there's always some local legend about, like, a crybaby bridge or a ghost in a particular house or something like that. And so I became a journalist, and I was playing with the idea of, like, I don't want to do much more true crime, but I know how to investigate these cases. So I'm like, what if I do something kind of like the Haunted Ohio books, except more into, like, monsters and legends like that? So I collected, I think, like a dozen of these legends throughout Ohio that I could investigate like an investigative journalist would, where, it's not some crazy story, seen by the local drunk. These are weird, unexplained tales by, police officers or park rangers or military people that don't have any reason to lie or make things up. And probably the most fascinating case to me that I got to investigate was the case of the Loveland Frog. And when I heard about this, I was a reporter for Scene, and it was so crazy. Like, I'd never heard of any legend like this ever. And the legend is in Loveland, Ohio, which is outside of Cincinnati. It's a sleepy little town on the banks of the Little Miami River. Back in 1972, this police officer was cruising around and doing his rounds and came across this, what he thought at first was the body of a bear that had died, and this big thing on the side of the road by the bridge. And he parked his cruiser and shined the light on it, and then it stood up on two legs. And he looked at it and he described it as something like a cross between a frog and a human. And so he gets out of the car and does what any red-blooded American police officer will do when faced with the unexplainable. He shoots at it, and it jumps down, away from him towards the water over the bridge, and it disappears. A second police officer sees this thing a couple days later and shoots at it too. So that became known as the Loveland Frog, and periodically through the years, people would see this half-man, half-frog thing on the banks of the Little Miami River. And I thought, what in the world is going on down there? So I went down and tracked down one of the police officers, and he talked to me. He said, I don't want to talk about what happened that night. It's done nothing but grief. It's been nothing but grief for me. I said, but what do you think it was? I mean, what the heck was it? And I said, the other police officer said it was just a giant lizard and to leave it alone and don't look into it. And I started to head back to my car, and he's like, oh, hold on. He's like, I will tell you this much. He said it wasn't a lizard. It was much, much bigger than anything anybody could keep as a pet in their house. And so I went, as a journalist, I love research, and I stopped in at the local historical society, and I found some articles and information about the founding of the town, and I found this story about these French missionaries that had visited the area in the early 1600s, and they talked about meeting this tribe of Indians called the Twitewee people. And the Twitewee chief warned them to stay away from the river because that was the domain of the Shawnahook. And the French missionary was like, what the heck is a Shawnahook? And the chief said, that's the half-man, half-frog thing that lives in the river. So these sightings go back centuries, and it's amazing. I have no idea what really is going on down there.
Yeah. So you talk about the Loveland Frog in the book. There's many other things in there about ghosts, aliens, Bigfoot, the legend of Red Eyes, which if you read the book, you would know that James experienced red eyes for himself when he was a child, and the Mothman. And through my investigating at the Mothman Festival this year, it turns out that the steakhouse that offers the Mothman sauce has since closed, so that mystery will remain unsolved, I guess.
Oh, man.
So
that was a great place.
Yeah. They do have Mothman cookies at this coffee shop, and there's a Mothman pizza, apparently, that you can get somewhere.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
I'll have to get back down there.
Yeah. So you wrote this book, and I guess, did you necessarily believe any of the things people were telling you, or is it all just...
I don't know. I have to say, I don't think I believe any of it until I saw it with my own eyes, but I do believe that they believe. And that's what fascinates me, is how these normal, everyday, average people with, jobs like police officers and, firemen, people that don't normally lie and make stuff up, they totally believe in things like the Loveland Frog or Bigfoot or aliens, and believe they've seen them. So, I don't know.
Do you want to believe?
I do. I want to believe.
Very cool. I feel the same way. I want to believe, but I don't know if I can bring myself to actually believe in anything. But I guess that is all the time we have for today. I guess one last thing. I did make a video about the It Came From Ohio. What kind of did you think when someone did a book review of one of your more obscure books?
Oh, I love it. Thank you. I every once in a while I'll go on YouTube and see if anybody's done anything. There's some reviews out there, and I love to see somebody else's interpretation of stories that I've written. It's the best.
Really, because I was geeking out for a second when you shared it and all that. I was like, oh my god, this famous author is sharing my stuff. He's having his book adapted by possibly Johnny Depp, and he has Bradley Cooper attached to him and all this, and I was just like, oh my god.
No, it's it's always it always means a lot. I don't, no matter who you are, and I'm not lucky enough yet, or God willing, maybe one day, but I'm sure even people like John Irving and Stephen King and Peter Straub and Neil Gaiman, they still love reading people about people that like their stuff. I mean, that's the ultimate. That's why they do it. That's why any of us do it.
Very cool. Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show and chatting with me today. And hopefully I will talk to you again sometime soon. I'd love to have you on whenever you have something coming out, or just whenever you want to chat. So thanks for coming on.
That'd be great. I appreciate it. Thanks so much. Send me the link when it's out.
Oh, I will, of course. Well, that was my conversation with James Renner. It was a really fun time. I hope to have James back on the show again sometime. If you enjoyed it, make sure you share it with a friend, click that subscribe button, and smash a like on this video. Also, leave me a comment on who you'd like to see on the show in the future. Again, you can find links to all of James's stuff at jamesrenner.com. And that's it for this first episode of the House of Horrors. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will see you next week with another interview. Take care.